It is perhaps mankind's greatest exploratory achievement. 477 years after crossing the Atlantic and discovering what was then the New World, humans escaped the mighty pull of Earth's gravity, broke away from its orbit, and set a course for the moon. Shooting into deep space at speeds greater than 24,000 miles per hour, covering nearly 250,000 miles, United States astronauts landed on the lunar surface on this day 50 years ago. Today, we proudly remain America's portal to new worlds as we prepare to return to the moon. Tonight, the story of how we got there from here and how we'll go back on this WFTV special, Eyewitness to History, Apollo 11, 50 years later.
Good evening, I'm Greg Warman.
And I'm Martha Sagowski. Tonight we are standing among the consoles and electronics from the original firing room, or the brains behind the Apollo 11 launch.
This is an incredible room. It was with these very devices, crude and rudimentary by today's standards, that dozens of NASA engineers helped astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins lift off from Launch Pad 39A just a few miles from here.
And tonight we're bringing you the stories of the men and women who made the incredible journey to the moon possible. Back then, our nation was engaged in a Cold War with the Soviets, and supremacy in space was considered essential. At least that was the thinking of a young president who challenged our nation to reach the moon by the end of the 1960s.
Obviously a daunting challenge, but one that some of our brightest minds and bravest souls met. Our trip to the moon began years before the summer of 1969, long before Apollo 11's launch from what we now call the Space Coast and the lunar landing watched by hundreds of millions on TV.
It is July 20th, 1969, and man is about to land on the moon.
Long before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin bounced around their spacecraft parked nearly 250,000 miles above Earth in the Sea of Tranquility. It all really started with an audacious challenge for our nation.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
When I got out of college, I took to heart what President Kennedy wanted us to do.
A full year before that speech in 1962, President Kennedy asked Congress to commit to landing on the moon. He did it just weeks after Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. Our collective manned space experience in May of 1961 amounted to 15 minutes of suborbital spaceflight. It seemed the United States had fallen behind in the space race. Apollo-era engineer Jim Ogle remembers JFK's challenge vividly.
The space race was here. We had a country that we were competing with.
For many, it seemed an impossible challenge, and yet 8 years later, at the end of a decade marked by tumult, national tragedy, war, and division, the United States unified behind a common goal and met JFK's challenge, and it all launched from Central Florida.
Man is about to land on the moon. Eagle will touch down approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes from now.
It all kind of came together, and in this little county, Brevard County, in Florida, and history was made, and I was part of it, but there were 400,000 people involved in this project all over America.
Ogle worked the Apollo missions and space shuttle missions that followed. Ogle's job was testing various systems as NASA workers stacked the massive Saturn V rocket inside the iconic Vehicle Assembly Building.
It was a team effort, and you had three people that was riding up in the tip of that thing that depended on what you were doing, depending on what all of us were doing to make sure that rocket was safe.
The challenge and then meeting it inspired Ogle's generation and those engineers who followed to believe that they were capable of great things when the will of the nation and its resources were committed.
And it was such an incredible challenge that President Kennedy set out for this country, very audacious. And I always tell people the Apollo, or the accomplishment of landing men on the moon, became kind of the gold standard by which we measured audacious challenges.
Laying down the challenge was one thing, but executing a mission to the moon that was something else entirely.
You are right, Greg. This was no simple task. It was quite literally rocket science. I took a look at the logistics, the manpower, and the money needed to get to the moon. It's difficult to imagine today how scientists, private industry, and a rapidly growing federal space agency somehow partnered on the infinitely complex, not to mention dangerous, goal of reaching the moon.
RTC, channel 121.
Perhaps harder to fathom how billions and billions of dollars controlled by politicians in Washington, amounts at times approaching 5% of the federal budget, were allocated to the Apollo program year after year.
Our Saturn V rocket, when it's completely assembled, stands 364 feet tall.
But that's what was needed to accomplish such a fantastic journey, escaping Earth's atmosphere and its orbit and leaping toward our closest neighbor in space.
7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hello, Houston, Apollo 11, go ahead.
It's the culmination of all of the other new technology that we had to develop in order to build a rocket and an engine for the rocket that had the power to lift the spacecraft with its, in hindsight, simple complexity. It was proof that you can figure that stuff out, you can build it, you can test it, and you can get it to operate for a specific purpose, which was beyond the realm of possible when the program was conceived some 10 years earlier.
Hundreds of thousands of workers in the private and public sectors played some part in the Apollo program. Elements of the Saturn V rocket and the manned modules it propelled into space came from all over the country. But all of that hardware and much of that brainpower was ultimately funneled here to Central Florida and the Space Coast, which grew into the nation's gateway to space 50 years ago and never really lost that proud distinction. For those who were part of the Apollo program, the teamwork displayed here back then was never forgotten.
25,000 people used to work here, and the 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week that we all worked, not all of us, but those of us that supported the launch. And the camaraderie that we had, and the very severe time frame and structures that we had to work with.
Those men and women mourn the loss of the crew of Apollo 1, Roger Chaffee, Ed White, and Gus Grissom, who perished when a flash fire consumed their command module during a rehearsal test in January 1967. And they question whether the tragedy would end the Apollo program. Many look back with pride at the nation's and NASA's resolve to continue.
The thing is that we chose a path to go, after the fire, and we stuck with it, and we did it. And that's the kind of thing that we can still do, and that's the kind of thing I hope we'll do.
A series of successes followed. Apollo 7 in October of 1968 was the first manned test of the Command Service Module. Apollo 8 that December was the first mission to take humans to the moon and back.
The historic 6-day, 3-hour mission of Apollo 8 demonstrated the performance of many activities.
And the first TV coverage of the lunar surface, including one on Christmas Eve.
And God said, "Let there be light."
Apollo 10 in May of 1969 was a complete dress rehearsal for Apollo 11, the only element missing, a lunar landing. That would take place 2 months later on this very date 50 years ago.
300 feet down, 3.5.
Roy Tharp, a retired NASA launch team member, remembers all of the Apollo launches and the knowledge gained with each passing one.
The technology was being built as we went from Apollo 8 to Apollo 9. Apollo 10, where we tested a whole system, we knew we were 90%, going to be 90% successful.
The lunar landing was at that time, and even now, one of our nation's crowning achievements.
It really was. Central Florida had a front row seat to so much of the Apollo program, its testing, its tragedies, and ultimately its thundering launches. But many have asked, why here? Why Brevard County?
I had been in the launch business most of my life, and I had watched an awful lot of rockets fail.
And I saw a lot of them go poof In the early days, it was always exciting to go out and watch one take off.
It took some time for America's rocket scientists to perfect their art. That is, harnessing what is essentially a guided missile and controlling it so that human beings could be launched upon a Saturn V rocket standing 40 stories tall, weighing 6.5 million pounds and requiring 7.5 million pounds of thrust to escape Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah, I don't know that many of us were really comfortable on the first launch that it was going to work. Once we got a couple of launches under the way, I think most of us were fairly comfortable that the launch vehicle would work, but boy, we were asking a lot of the rest of it.
Here, go for staging, 10.
Being apprehensive about spaceflight was understandable. Before the Apollo launches, there was plenty of trial and error out at the Cape. Yet those errors early on in the space program, along with the guidance of German-American rocket engineer Werner von Braun, allowed NASA scientists and the private companies working on the space program to learn from failure.
He was the man for the job as far as I was concerned.
In 1960, a study group considered 8 locations for the manned lunar landing launch site.
The fact that the Cape was in what was then a relatively remote part of the state, sitting alongside the vast Atlantic, allowed plenty of room for error. NASA's Bob Seek detailed some other factors that made the Cape so attractive.
First of all, it was the government owned most of it, and what they didn't by eminent domain, they took it over. It's close to the equator, so you get the maximum benefit of the rotation of the Earth to help with the thrust of getting the vehicle into orbit. It's the furthest east, so you have the ability to launch at a more northerly trajectory if you have to, without flying over populated areas.
Huge bulldozers and earth movers rolled across the coastal wilderness, clearing everything in their path.
Jim Ogle worked in the Apollo program, but also grew up in Brevard.
At the time of its construction, this building, in terms of cubic volume, was the largest in the world.
So he witnessed the birth of America's rocket and space program in the early 50s and its coming of age in the 60s.
I had witnessed the first launch out here of the V2 rocket because I grew up here and went to Cocoa High School, and it was an amazing that I would be working out here 8 years later on the missile program. When they decided to go to the moon, we had Cape Canaveral, but NASA said, hey, we need the Merritt Island launch area, called Mila. That's what they called it back then. And they bought up 88,000 acres out here.
Like Ogle and so many others from the Apollo era, Bill Hike looks back with a pride at the work done on what is now the Space Coast.
I don't think there was any real sensation of the fact that, my God, we're making history here. We were doing a job that we loved to do. Most of us loved to launch rockets.
Coming up next, we'll take a close-up look at the heavy equipment and infrastructure used back then and still being used today to assemble, transport, and launch spacecraft from here, the Kennedy Space Center.
And you'll see an incredible animated recreation of the Apollo 11 mission. It's all after this break.
Welcome back to Eyewitness to History. Apollo 11, 50 years later, our recollection and recognition of that historic mission and man first walking on the moon.
The folks here at Kennedy Space Center recently gave us unprecedented access to the facilities that make America's historic moonshot possible. Those include the iconic Vehicle Assembly Building and the hulking crawler transporter that carried the massive Saturn V rocket to the launch pad.
We also toured one of those pads where Apollo rockets launch from, and the actual firing room where Apollo 11's launch was monitored and controlled.
But first, let's visit the VAB where the Apollo rockets and the space shuttles that followed were assembled. It remains one of the largest buildings in the world by area, standing 525 feet tall and 518 feet wide. That size makes the vehicle assembly building hard to miss, along with the massive American flag and NASA logo painted on its south side. But size was required in the mid-1960s when we needed to assemble Saturn V rockets for the moon missions. They were the largest, most complex rockets ever made at that time, and the VAB allowed for them to get stacked before undergoing a series of tests and certifications.
We all had a common goal. We had to verify, learn the systems, write the procedures, run the procedures over and over again to make sure that everything worked and worked perfectly, because you got 3 lives on the tip of this thing that are depending on you.
The VAB has 4 high bays, 2 on the building's east side and 2 on the west side. Each bay has a 456-foot high door, the largest in the world.
For each of these high bays, work platforms were assembled outside the building and moved inside for mounting.
Oh, it's an amazing feat what happened in such a very short period of time. I always point out that it was 5 years from President Kennedy's speech in May of 1961 to when they rolled out the first test vehicle, the 500F Saturn V test vehicle, to the day, May 25th of 1966. And to this day, it still holds the record of being the largest single-story building ever constructed. Absolutely. Just the foundation is amazing.
After spending all that time in the VAB running tests and preparing rockets for launches,
You had to learn it really good.
Jim Ogle especially remembers the Apollo 11 launch.
I was here for all of the Apollo moon missions, but that was the most significant one.
For Ogle and many others who worked in this building, there was the pressure to dominate the space race and get to the moon first, but also the need to ensure our astronauts made it there and back. The VAB outlasted the Saturn and shuttle programs. It's been reconfigured, it's been updated, and now it's where NASA's Space Launch System, or SLS, will be assembled below the Orion spacecraft for America's return to deep space.
Another Apollo-era piece of equipment that's being repurposed for America's future space missions is the Crawler Transporter, the massive vehicle that brought Apollo 11 and many other spacecraft out to the launch pads. The Crawler Transporter 2, or CT-2, is not built for speed. It travels at 1 mile per hour when it's loaded and 2 miles per hour when unloaded. This is one of 2 crawlers. You've seen these on television and in coverage as they take, whether it's the Apollo rockets, the space shuttle out to the pad, and it will be used for Artemis. It has gone through a number of changes and upgrades, but for the most part, the technology from 1965 still in use today. But with a deck the size of a baseball infield, the crawler was originally designed to haul the Saturn V rockets down the crawlerway out to the launch pads, a trip that can take 8 hours with engineers and technicians riding on board.
And you can literally walk around this and touch things that were here when Apollo was here. Actually, most of this is all vintage Apollo. Back when this was designed, we did drawings on paper with pencil and a straight edge, and we did calculations with a slide rule. So they tended to do things very robust, large factors of safety, which is a testament to why this thing is still running. Today we would design this on a CAD machine with this much margin, and we don't know how long it would last.
The crawler on its own weighs 6.6 million pounds, about the weight of 1,000 pickup trucks, and it's capable of transporting another 18 million pounds. The crawler would haul the Apollo rockets from the vehicle assembly building out to the launch pad.
And one of those pads, the famous 39B, was the next stop on our recent tour of the sprawling facility at Kennedy Space Center. In May of 1969, Apollo 10 launched from this pad in what became a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. And 2 months later, Apollo 11 launched from the similarly designed pad 39A just to the south. And as became the process for all launches, the Apollo rockets were stacked alongside mobile launch towers in the VAB, and the crawler carried them down the 4-mile track.
Many of the things that you see here at the pad were here 50, 60 years ago. Some of the structures that we used to use are no longer required, and they have been removed, and we've kept the best of what we needed.
Like so many major pieces of the infrastructure at KSC, these launch pads were built to last.
And what they were able to do without the computers and all the IT that we have today, the things that they thought about, and they were doing something that had never been done before, it's actually mind-blowing and it's humbling. What we do now is so difficult, but without standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, it would be near impossible.
NASA's Space Launch System rocket, being built for deep space missions and a journey to Mars, will launch from this pad. Over the years, it's received significant upgrades, including improvements to the flame trench beneath the surface. And these towers surrounding the pad stand 600 feet. They're designed to protect launch vehicles from lightning.
And to come and be able to reuse this for a rocket even more powerful than the Saturn V is amazing.
Even a veteran Apollo-era electronics engineer like Ken Poinbuff anxiously awaits launching even larger rockets from Pad 39B.
I am really looking forward to it. This is going to be a very, very exciting multiple years from now. Very soon we're going to see the largest spacecraft launch that we've ever seen, that anyone's ever seen. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be exciting.
But Poinbuff will have to see if that excitement rivals the moment he saw Neil Armstrong jump from the lunar module and step on the moon.
We're just in awe. Everybody's jaw dropped, and we all were so proud of people.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The launch pads here at KSC are truly our nation's gateways to space, and they're proof of how designs and construction from Apollo 11's era are applied today.
Our final stop on the tour today, one of the historic firing rooms here at the Space Center. Now, of course, we're standing with the original equipment used 50 years ago to monitor and get Apollo 11 launched, but the room where all those engineers you see sitting in front of the consoles and monitors, that's part of the Launch Control Center, it's actually still in use out here today.
Apollo 11, this is the Launch Operations Manager. The launch team wishes you good luck and Godspeed.
T-minus 10, 9, 8. We have a go for main engine start. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Roger, clock. Clock start flight, Roger. Clear the tower.
It's this firing room that served as the brains for the launch of Apollo 11. Everything from prepping the rocket to checking the status of the spacecraft and monitoring payloads was done from this central nervous system of a room which, through the years, has seen major changes as computers and technology improved. But in July of 1969, mostly men in white shirts and black ties monitored bulky consoles and tiny black and white monitors, counting down the hours, minutes, and seconds until the Apollo 11 rocket fired up and slowly cleared the launch pad.
It's all meters and dials and switches.
Bob Seek with the Apollo launch team recalls the importance of ensuring a successful launch.
They're the typical, use the term, steely-eyed rocket scientists looking at their displays that they're responsible for. This is our job, and we're going to do it correctly. Now, 50 years later, in hindsight, you look back and, okay, it was a big deal.
When the launch portion of the mission was complete, the entire room turned in their seats and watched the Saturn V rocket climb toward the skies through the large windows of Firing Room 1. And all these years later, today's generation of top engineers, like Charlie Blackwell Thompson, NASA's EM-1 launch director, says there are many similarities between the way Apollo's team guided launches off pads 39A and 39B and the way they'll launch the SLS from this facility.
If you go back and listen to historical footage, be it from Shuttle, be it from Apollo, when you hear those calls coming in those final minutes of launch countdown, they sound very similar across the programs, and that is because we have found in our launch operations that understanding immediately what our problem is, if we need to hold the countdown clock, those are things that you want to know regardless of what vehicle you're working on.
You can feel the sense of history in this recreation and authentic display of the firing room from the Apollo era.
This is amazing. Hopefully it comes across on TV. They got every detail down, from the packs of cigarettes on the counters to the now antiquated equipment that these NASA scientists used successfully to launch Apollo 11. You can see it for yourself by visiting the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex.
Once Apollo 11 lifted off from the Cape, engineers in Houston took over control of the mission. And while much of Apollo 11's journey was televised, most of us never saw the intricate maneuvers the astronauts needed to perform in order to get to the moon. We wanted to show you exactly how this mission played out from the launch to deep space to the moon and back. And with computer animation and radio transmissions from Apollo 11, we were able to do just that.
2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All of Central Florida and hundreds of millions around the world watched the Apollo 11 launch from what was Cape Kennedy, the morning of July 16, 1969. And of course, people worldwide sat riveted, watching their television sets as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the lunar surface and became the first men to explore its dusty, cratered face.
Okay, engine stop. APA at a detent. We copy you down, Eagle.
But we didn't get to see what happened in between that historic launch and landing. Today, though, computer animation gives us a pretty good idea of what happened. The Saturn V's first stage included 5 F1 engines. They produced the 7.7 million pounds of thrust needed to escape Earth's gravity. The first stage lifted the rocket to an altitude of 38 miles in about 2.5 minutes. It then separated, only to burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. The second stage contained 5 more J2 engines. They burned for about 6 minutes, taking the astronauts, their vehicle, and payload to 115 miles altitude, and then that stage broke away. Apollo 11's third stage, with 1 more J2 engine, burned for nearly another 3 minutes, pushing the rocket to orbital velocity, roughly 17,500 miles per hour. But then the third stage was shut down with fuel left and remained attached to the spacecraft.
Shut down right on time.
Apollo 11 then orbited Earth 1.5 times before the J2 engine was reignited and shot the rocket on a trans-lunar trajectory.
We confirm ignition and the thrust is go.
Also called a trans-lunar injection burn at a speed of 24,500 miles per hour.
Cut off.
Next, nearly 3.5 hours after launch,
We are now coming up on 30 seconds to acquisition of the command module.
the command service module, which served as the crew compartment and control center, separated, turned 180 degrees, and docked with the lunar module, and together they moved on toward the moon. By July 20th, more than 100 hours after launch, the lunar module separated from the command service module, the LM carrying Armstrong and Aldrin on the final leg of the journey to the lunar surface.
Eagle Houston, we rig you now. You're a go for PDI, over.
In another 2 hours, the LM landed on the moon.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Armstrong took the first step on the lunar surface shortly before 10 p.m., July 20th, 50 years ago.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He and Aldrin stayed on the moon until nearly 1 p.m., July 21st, conducting experiments, collecting rocks, and trying to sleep before blasting off from the moon back to the command service module.
Fourth stage, engine arm ascent, proceed.
In 4 hours, the lunar module and CSM made a second rendezvous. After docking, Aldrin and Armstrong left the LM and joined up with Michael Collins, who had stayed behind in the command service module. Then the lunar module was jettisoned, and the spacecraft began a trans-Earth injection 135 hours into the mission, a course back home.
Roger, we got you coming home.
The cruise capsule, the command module Columbia, later separated from the service module just before re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. It was the only part of the Apollo 11 stack to return to Earth.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
And on July 24th at 11:50 a.m., 195 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds after launch, the Apollo 11 crew splashed down safely in the North Pacific Ocean.
And the flags are waving and the cigars are being lit up.
Martha, what a cool recreation of the Apollo 11 mission that our graphics team was able to put together for you.
It certainly was, Greg. Coming up, we're going to meet the one woman in the firing room that day 50 years ago when Apollo 11 launched. And we'll see how NASA's next mission to deep space will have a much more diverse team leading our nation's new era of exploration.